Hello, Dan Proft with another installment of Against the Current. Today our guest is author Mike Lotus. He wrote the book America 3.0. We're coming to you live from the Skyline Club atop the Old Republic building in downtown Chicago. Mike, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Pleasure as always, sir.
So America 3.0, that implies there was an America 1.0 and an America 2.0. So why don't we wind the clock back and explain what, in your parlance, 1.0, 2.0 were, and where we're going with 3.0.
Sure. America 1.0 was agricultural era America, era of the founding, muscle power, pre-industrial America. A great place in many ways, poor but free. America 2.0 is the era that we're coming out of now, that's in decline, that's falling apart. That's industrial era America, that's a hierarchical, centralized, big government, big business, that America, the one we grew up in. In many ways it was a great country, but as we can see, many of our institutions are failing, the governments are going broke, the big businesses can't do what they used to do. So we're groping toward a future that we haven't really gotten our arms around yet. That future is America 3.0. And of course, we're speculating what that's going to be like. What we hope it will be like is a more decentralized, networked rather than top-down, a freer, wealthier society where individual and family scale businesses can be very productive and look out for themselves and not need the kind of framework that we've lived with in the 20th century.
So is America 3.0 what Fareed Zakaria has called the post-American world, where we have the rise of the rest and America recedes into being just another significant country but not the world's singular superpower?
I don't think that's right. I think that America will, in fact, enjoy a renaissance of productivity, and where economic wealth generally translates into political power. What I hope will happen is we'll be a little less intrusive and less invasive in other countries where we're not going to be effective. Nation building and that sort of thing isn't going to work.
Well, so what's a historical example of an empire that builds and builds and builds with ever-expanding government that then maintains its empire status, but has a government that shrinks to expand the freedom of the individual? Is there such an example?
The United States reinvented itself once. We went from a very different type of society to an industrial era society with a lot of turmoil, a lot of hardship around the turn of the previous century. I expect that sort of level of disorder and changing of institutions is something we're going to have to go through again.
So there's no such example, is what you're saying. There's no such historical example. I mean, because I think this is the question that people have is, how do you rein in Leviathan? And it seems to me that the answer is you don't, absent some kind of Pompeii-like cataclysmic event.
Well, here we are sitting in beautiful downtown Chicago, and we are, one of the worst cases of Leviathan going broke is Illinois. Leviathan runs out of money.
In Chicago specifically.
In Chicago specifically, and the Park District and the schools and the county and everything else. Now, if we see a situation where the American public sector goes broke, does that mean America is gone? No, we changed the fundamental nature of our government several times in our history.
But if the public sector goes broke, when you have, just think locally, for example, before we talk globally, the top employers in Cook County, the city of Chicago, the county of Cook,
yes,
the Chicago public school system, the state of Illinois. 4 of the top 5 employers are government. So the problem is government imploding is not a localized event. What government does with the monopoly of force is extract from the private sector and the private citizenry to continue to fund government, because of course the response to big government that fails is, well, it wasn't big enough.
Well, they're going to double down and try to do that. There's no doubt about it. I mean, the process
it's happening.
It's going to get worse before it gets better. The capacity of the government to extract resources may not be what it was in the past. If people can encrypt their information, if we have something like the Bitcoin, later developments of that, it may be possible to just do transactions that are impenetrable to the government. Also, we are going to have a community that's being pushed harder and harder. We still do have democracy to some degree. We still have a court system. We still do have alternatives where you can move to states that are better governed. So the idea that, we're basically going to need a heroic reform movement to push back against this, dismantle these things that don't work, and clear the way for the creative power of the American people to take advantage of all this new opportunity.
Is it going to be a heroic reform movement, or is it going to be that we go over the precipice and you have chaos, and from that chaos, if we're lucky, the extreme that people gravitate to is a model that is rooted in individual freedom rather than in totalitarian government? And that's an open question.
Well, first off, how hard the transition is has a lot to do with the initiative of the people who are going through it. If we have good proposals and policy changes before things go completely to hell, then we'll be better off. And that's what it's up to us to do. And as far as the government becoming truly totalitarian, the English-speaking people have never been good at totalitarianism. They've never really tried it. We have not elected any fascists to any parliament or Congress of the United States or the rest of the English-speaking world. Very small number of communists. It's not our bag. We're not that good at it. And the American people are likely to resist before that type of oppressive level of government power really comes down.
So we have our country, our neighbor across, our friend and ally across the pond, England, just this year celebrated the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta. So they've got a little bit deeper and richer history in self-governance of sorts than does America. And Daniel Hannan, a fan, we're both a fan of Daniel Hannan, member of the European Parliament,
yes.
Written a number of excellent books. But essentially what he says is a warning to the West, a warning to America specifically: don't follow England's example.
That's right.
So what does that say? They're 800 years in. Now, I know they don't have a constitution like we do. The parliamentary form of government is a bit different than our representative republic. But what does that say about our chances, this plucky little country that's 240 years into its empire?
Britain...
Well, less than that into its empire, but 240 years into its existence.
Well, Britain has always been more stratified, class-centric. The government's very powerful there. I don't know, Britain's still a relatively free country compared to the rest of the world. It's always a matter of compared to what. If you look at international surveys of the English-speaking countries compared to the rest of the world, we're much more liberty-loving, we're much more decentralized, we have a much weaker welfare state. Britain has a much more heavily controlled healthcare sector, but they actually have a lot more freedom in terms of school choice than we do. It's a matter of what the focus is.
Yeah, but I mean, are we talking about effectively, I mean, America 3.0 holds out promise. Yours is an optimistic tone.
Ultimately.
Yes, ultimately, a good qualifier. But I mean, are we talking about the way that you're talking about it, to borrow a Buckleyism, being the tallest skyscraper in Wichita?
No, I don't think that's right. I think that we're going to be quite a bit better off than we are now, and we're going to not be the tallest skyscraper in Wichita. We're going to be in a much freer and much more productive scenario than we're in right now. The technology that's coming is going to permit us to be extremely productive, and the biggest obstacles to these changes are government regulation and taxation.
Technology is going to save us. I mean, this sounds a little bit more like William Gibson than it does kind of a political track rooted in this experiment called representative republicanism. I mean, what did Gibson say, right? The future is here, it's just distributed unevenly.
Exactly.
So is that what you're suggesting?
No, well, yeah, I quote Gibson. Look, the technology that underlies any society is going to have a major impact on how that society organizes itself and how it works. Much of 20th century America was a result of the underlying technology. You needed to have centralization for railroads and telegraphs, and then you had the telephone, and you had the type of arrangements that we had in the 20th century. We're moving towards something that allows all the customers and all the clients to find each other around the world in a flatter, more networked kind of way.
Okay.
It's going to happen.
Okay, but this is essentially a Gingrichian construct or formulation, which is the fourth wave. You know, the digital economy is going to save us from ourselves.
Well, look, you have to understand that the worst possible scenarios are always on the table, right? Sure, we can end up with a government that's completely centralized, that has us under surveillance all the time. We have an American Gestapo, and nothing good ever happens, okay? Now, nothing happens all by itself. The founders could have chosen not to go to war with the British and not thrown them out and not created their own country. Or
why can't you just let us conservatives have our dystopian future
because,
that we predict? Why can't you just leave us alone?
Conservatives have way too much fun.
To be fatalistic.
Conservatives have this perverse type of pessimism. They actually want to talk about why we're doomed and how Obama's finished off the country and we're ruined and there's no hope. And then they want to sit back and have a drink And I hate to
much easier.
snatch this pleasure, this pleasant thing from their lips and say, no, you actually are going to have to bestir yourself to try to save the country and make a better future for yourself and your kids and your grandchildren. And it may not work, but you have to try. And there's no choices.
How depressing that is.
Yeah.
So in the book, you write about this transition to America 3.0. You talk about a great U-turn.
Right.
That's going to essentially be the lead-in to the transition.
That actually started already.
Oh, explain it.
Well, really, it's funny because we tend to think that things are very bad now. At the end of World War II, the government's control of the economy, of people's individual choices, of where they were going to live, what they were going to do, we had conscription, was actually worse than it is now. And we began to turn away from it. And in Western Europe, you began to create a true social democratic state. We never really went down that road. So the U-turn actually began many, many years ago. And you had the opening up of the West and the Sun Belt and the post-war boom that came out of that. So that was really the beginning of the U-turn. We think that America has always is for many, many decades been on a path not into a truly, completely stagnant, centralized, socialistic type of arrangement. And every time we've gotten that, we've had backlashes. We had the original conservative movement that arose in the 1960s. You had Reagan. You had Gingrich in 1994. You had the Tea Party. There's a constant pushback. And I think what we're on now, we're eventually going to see a little more institutional coherence, perhaps the formation of new factions within the Republican Party that'll have some policy proposals that'll move things in the direction I'd like to see.
So you mentioned institutional change, system change, in a sense. So Neil Ferguson, the great Harvard historian, wrote the book The Great Degeneration, where he borrows from Adam Smith and talks about the stagnation state, where you have slow growth, where you have two characteristics. The majority of the population works for low wages, and you have an elite that knows how to game the system to maximize their benefit. Does that sound at all familiar in terms of describing 21st century America?
Well, it's certainly a scary scenario, and we see some movement in that direction, right? We see a middle class that's losing its wherewithal. And
you see a hollowing out of stagnant places like Chicago and Illinois, people fleeing.
Well, sure, but that's because the government sectors here are particularly pernicious in some of these places, mostly in the northeast quadrant of the United States. And the fact that they move and have the option of moving shows you some of the reasons why it's not likely to last.
Yeah, but how many laboratories of democracy in our 50 laboratories are functioning in a way that is moving towards that transition you described?
It's a variable geometry, right? Indiana, Texas are better than here in some ways. Florida has some things that are better than here in terms of how they do Medicaid, for example. I'm not going to tell you that I can tell you which of these places are going to work a lot better over the next 20 or 30 years. Illinois, however, I think is a good, scary example of what not to do.
So what's the horizon? If this is not a kind of a 20 or 30 year U-turn to that America 3.0, I mean, what are we talking about?
I think 20 years, 25 years. That's what in our book, the first chapter is set in 2040, which I think is fairly pessimistic. I think things will change a lot before then. If I had millions of dollars, I suppose I could bet my own money and invest in my own predictions, right? But the public sector as it's set up now is unsustainable. So how soon there's some kind of crisis of the regime that's not going to be acceptable anymore, that people aren't going to accept the risk of buying American bonds, whatever it might be, and we're going to need some basic change, that could happen fairly soon. Plus, we see technologies opening up other opportunities. We see that, Airbnb and you see Uber and these things are just the first wave of the ability of people to do things without working through the heavily taxed, heavily regulated parts of the existing economy.
Right, although they're kind of fighting every step of the way.
Of course, but
right?
that's
fighting
expected.
Leviathan every step of the way. I understand.
Right, but when you had the steam engine, the guys who lived by the previous way of life tried to stop that too.
Right.
That's what always happens.
Right, the candle makers
Exactly.
against the advent of electricity and all that.
You feel the pain of the old way dying before you see the benefit of the new way that's coming. It's what always happens.
Okay, but let's take a step back and let's get to kind of first principles or fundamentals, if you will. And so the intergenerational compact that made America markedly different, that we owe a duty to our ancestry who left us this thing and a duty to our progeny to leave this thing in better condition than we received it.
Right.
Has that not been broken? And if so, then how do you refashion it?
Well, I think that concept has withered away to some degree, though not as much as you might think. The educational system in this country for 50 years has been very destructive. We have the decay, our cultural confidence and belief in ourselves, belief in our history, belief in the goodness of our own system and what it's done for people has not been preserved as well as it should. So that's certainly true. Now, is this permanent? I don't see the public education sector of this country as something that's going to go on exactly the way it has for another 50 years. I mean, it's already antiquated to have people march into a cement building and sit facing a blackboard like they did in 1915. In 2015 is already an anachronism.
So it's a Stein's Law argument.
Well, if it can't go on, it won't. But it's also the argument that parents want what's good for their kids, and their options to change that and do something different are going to improve. We see there's actually a desire in people, for people want to know more about their own country. They want to feel positive things about America and about what our history is and why it's good, and so we're going to have to provide that.
Yeah, no? but when you see, I mean, let's talk about this. You have, I mean, this data point is a couple of years old, but the gist of it, I suspect, is still largely accurate. 18 of our 50 most populous cities. Mm-hmm. So almost 40% of America's most populous cities have high school systems where the graduation rate is sub 50%.
Sure.
So if you're not educating the citizenry in the fundamentals of living in a free society, mm-hmm. and they're certainly not prepared to go on to post-secondary education or the workforce, then how does that transition occur when you have people that are ill-equipped to make it?
Well, first off, if you have the big cities and a relatively poor and deprived population, they've been very ill-served by the public education system. People in better-off suburbs they tend to do okay.
But they're tethered to it. I mean, I understand. You see some of the survey results where people, in the abstract, support a different model. They want their children to go to good schools, just like the wealthy or the politically connected. Mm-hmm. But there's a behavioral disconnect. They don't support politicians who believe that to be true, who advance policies in that direction. Mm-hmm. And so how do you break these cycles?
If you see a problem, a social problem, you need to have some political initiative to attack the problem and try to fix it. 100 years ago or more, the progressive movement began because they saw these slums, they saw these depressions that had put masses of people on the street with no unemployment insurance, and whether or not all of their ideas were good, they came up with them and they advocated for them and they pushed them, and it took a couple of generations before the New Deal basically incorporated their agenda. If we see the major cities of America with minority populations getting wretched, terrible public education that's expensive, we need to be aggressively promoting alternatives, getting those people to vote for it, reaching out to them. In Chicago, we have a GOP Republican Party that has not even asked for a black vote except for Bruce Rauner forever. Why aren't we telling them, you are ill-served by the Chicago public schools. You should have school choice. You should have alternatives. You should have vouchers so that you can pay people to teach your kids in a better way. These problems won't fix themselves. We need to come up with proposals that will work, promote them, get them enacted into law, and start making the reforms we need to clear the decks for where the country's going. None of this happens by itself.
Yeah, one of my favorite lines from you that I steal and make my own often, so I appreciate that, your allowance of me to do to you what Joe Biden did to Neil Kinnock.
But you give me credit. So.
Yes, but it's that these problems that afflict us didn't come here on spaceships, right? We did this
Flying saucers didn't land on the White House lawn, right?
Right, yes, except in Mars attacks.
The day the Earth stood still, Michael Rennie.
That too. But so the problems that come here on spaceships, so they're man-made problems, thus they're a man-made solution. So what are some of the bright spots that suggest there are man-made solutions out there that we could scale? School choice, maybe one of them. We see school choice programs in 14 states that run 24 different odd school choice programs. Are there other leading indicators that you look to and say, aha, this is why there's reason for optimism. This is why we're going to ultimately transition to America 3.0 in 30 years?
Well, the three biggest expenses people have: education, healthcare, and housing. All of those are very heavily regulated and wasteful and expensive. In healthcare, there were all kinds of opportunities that would exist if we had a more market-like way of providing it. If people were given some kind of voucher-like funding rather than having things come through a very stultified system like we have now.
I love what Steve Forbes says on that, right, too. In every other business, if you have increased demand for your service or product, that's a good thing. In healthcare, we call that a crisis.
Right.
And it's a crisis because it's centrally planned, so you're trying to kind of keep the wheels spinning without understanding all the externalities, the ability to serve diverse customers.
Right, exactly. And try to centrally plan anything, it doesn't work. It's the Frederick Hayek, it's the knowledge problem. The commissar at his desk does not know what millions of people, millions of patients, millions of physicians, millions of people trying to come up with thousands of solutions every day that then become best practices and change things. There's low-hanging fruit there.
Yeah, but there's low-hanging fruit there. But I mean, we'll get to housing and education, but to stick on healthcare, there's low-hanging fruit there, and yet we have a backdoor government takeover of healthcare with Obamacare, and we have a Republican Party that, depending on the day, doesn't seem all that interested in undoing the underpinnings of Obamacare.
Well, I'll be the short-term pessimist for the moment and say it's worse than a government takeover. It's a collusive, crony, capitalist government takeover where the insurance companies were the only winners from Obamacare, right? Now, are we going to assume the American people are just going to say, you know what, we're going to have a deal where the very wealthy and the people who are connected to the government get health care that's good, like in the Soviet system, and the rest of us are on crappy Medicaid, and we have doctors who don't want to show up for work because they're not well compensated? I don't know. This is a middle-class country. This is a country that flips out if your hamburger comes with tomato when you didn't want tomato. Are people going to forever put up with this, or are they going to say, I'm going to demand...
I don't know. I mean, are people afflicted with a particular strain of Stockholm Syndrome where they identify with their captors? I mean, I watched this, just as an aside, but to illustrate my point, to continue to be the cynic to your optimist, I watched this documentary on Scientology, right? This cult, this craziness. Paul Haggis, sophisticated screenwriter, very successful, $1 Million Baby, and all these things. It took him 30 years to figure out that Scientology was an abusive scam, right? Didn't want to look at what was actually happening. When he finally decided to look at what was happening, the evidence that was being compiled and distributed, he was aghast and he quit. Took him 3 decades. It's a granular example, but it doesn't highlight. People don't want to look at what's occurring until it directly affects them. And it's like Attolian fever. The time to catch Attolian fever and cure yourself is before you know you have it. By the time you know you have it, you're dead.
The American people have over history been pretty practical and down to earth. We've never been anarchists who don't want government, and we haven't been people who worship the state and think it's great. We want it to just work. We want to pay for it, have it work, get what we want, and not have to deal with it too much. That's not what we're facing right now. Your typical suburban American family facing much higher premiums, higher deductibles, poorer service is going to start screaming bloody murder, and they're already starting to. And when they demand a reform, they'll get it. And when they demand that, look, the American people, as in a democracy, are rationally ignorant. By which I mean they know all about the stuff they need to do to make a living, they know where the kids go to school, they know when the hockey practice is, but they don't have time to get into the weeds of public policy. We're weird. We like that stuff. We like to talk about these things. They don't care.
Yes,
let me just finish this. Okay. If you have a Democrat and he stinks, they put a Republican in. Okay, and so what you want to do is have have some faction, hopefully within the Republican Party. I'd love to see a reform faction in the Democrat Party, and there are wisps that could happen. People who are against, say, crony capitalism and government and business being in bed with each other.
Yeah, but those are the socialists.
I know, it's too bad. Well, they diagnosed the problem, but the medicine would kill the patient.
Right,
so it's still.
Bernie Sanders is not going to save us from ourselves.
Bernie Sanders,
I hate to break it to you.
Hillary's always wrong because she's 100% corrupt, and Bernie's right 20% of the time because he understands the problem, sort of, but his prescriptions would kill you. So, okay, fine. I don't think they're there yet. Okay,
right.
Within the Republican Party, we see some pretty substantial factions of people, I think, understand the problem and are trying to fix it. And then we have the guys who just, Mitch McConnell said, we got a majority, now we have to keep it. Well, why? So that we can chug through helping our friends and keeping our jobs and getting reelected to do what we always do. Except that type of politics, that type of normal politics for normal times, doesn't work in revolutionary times. And we live in revolutionary times. We live in a time when the model we've always lived with is falling apart. And everyone can see it's falling apart. The government can't do anything. It can't build a road to get to the Golden Gate Bridge in 10 years. We can't build a high-speed train in the Northeast.
Well, forget building a road to the Golden Gate Bridge in 10 years. it takes us longer to fire a bad teacher than it does to build the Golden Gate Bridge.
Right.
Seriously.
So, but let me flip this around. So here's Dan Proft saying the government's going to take over and we're going to have an American KGB that's going to ruin everything.
Well,
and then we got a government that can't do it.
That's a little bit hysterical.
Okay, that's a little bit
hysterical.
hysterical.
Get a hold of yourself.
Oh, come on.
Yes.
Well, you can. All right. Turnabout is fair play. Bottom line is this thing isn't good at anything. They couldn't.
Yes.
They're incompetent.
Well, but a great man once said that things are not broken, as the politicians say, they're fixed. Mm-hmm. That great man, of course, was me.
I recall that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, what I meant by that, the idea that they're incompetent, they don't know what they're doing. It's worse than that. They do know what they're doing, and wiring the game for their benefit and the detriment of the people who play by the rules in this state of Illinois, in this country of the United States, serves the political elites very well. So
Right.
it's much more pernicious than the idea that they're just buffoons and they don't know how to stop hackers from accessing 32 million federal records.
Right. Or keeping the Chinese from reading our OPM records and knowing everything about our
that's
top
right.
secret information.
Yes,
right. This is
right.
yet
That's
another
what I'm
example of
referring.
abject failure.
Yes, but
They're incompetent.
Well, but is it just incompetence or is it wiring the system?
They're malicious and incompetent. I'll give you
Okay,
that.
okay.
But they're not good at it. And do you think the public is
Well-
going to just sit here forever and just say, all right, that's it, take me to the gulag, I'm going to, be like in Czechoslovakia in 1971 and stand in line for bread. I don't know about the American people. I know people who just, they don't like it when these things happen. And in Illinois,
agree.
they leave.
I agree.
If they got nowhere to go, they'll fight.
I agree, but short of taking you to the gulag, they can effectively put you in a gulag without physically taking you there. Right? That's what the regulatory state does.
Right.
And so, I mean, it's the boiling of a frog.
Right.
And so is that what's happening?
Well, that's what they're trying to do.
Right, and how are they? They're fairly successful. I mean, you'll note the recidivism rate, meaning the re-election rate at the federal level, and even in the state of Illinois. I mean, it's 90% plus. So these people who you say are malicious and incompetent get re-elected at a 90% clip. So how does that portend to a
I'm not sure
transition?
that the elected arms really matter nearly as much as people tend to think. I mean, you have the bureaucracies there day in, day out, year after year, decade after decade, and chugging away, right? We know this, and the guy gets elected. But look, unless people are aware that there's a problem and they're mobilized to change it, they won't, okay? The people who led the American Revolution chose to step up and do something. The Whig Party just kind of chugged along and tolerated the abuses of the slave South until finally a bunch of people from New England and Illinois and other places said, this has to stop.
Right.
And they get organized, okay? People in the late 19th century who were the progressives said, we can't just let these slums full of foreigners where you can get your throat cut go on like this. We got to go in and clean them up and get these kids to school, and we got to have unemployment insurance because the people can't starve if there's a downturn, and they did it, all right? And the changes we're going to need to make are going to require leadership, proposing policies, and running for office and winning, and passing laws and changing things. Now,
So let me tell you what your actual solutions are.
Okay.
That are outlined in your book that you haven't gotten to. I mean,
there's so much in the book.
I don't mean to be.
People really need to buy it and read it all. Then we need to do this again.
They do. I mean, the book is excellent, but you've missed the core of it, which is very different than any other book.
Okay.
All right.
I know you know.
I'm your publicist at large.
Bring it on, baby.
Two things. One is the platoons of democracy, as Burke referred to them, that we civically engage and organize in a way that no other country in the history of the planet has ever done. So civic activism. And the other is the genius and the differential of the American family, the structure of the American family. Talk to both of those as the real key to transitioning someday to America 3.0.
Okay, sure. If you try to understand why countries have the character that they do, why they are the way they are, people look at the history. Tocqueville went back to the Puritans. He said it was Protestantism and Puritanism. Max Weber said that. But you can actually go back farther. And there's a French anthropologist, and the joke I always say, it's like, well, how can any conservative like a sentence that begins with "there's a French anthropologist"? But this guy's actually pretty good. A guy named Emmanuel Todd, who we look at, and he looks at family structure. And
nobody does French anthropology humor like you do.
It's my niche.
Very
it's my
good.
niche, baby. And what Todd looked at is what types of family structures in what parts of the world led to what types of political regimes. And he was focusing actually on communism in the 1970s. And he said the particular types of families you have in these communist countries all look the same. They're an authoritarian type of parent, and the kids are all subject to that control, and then they want to overthrow that, but then you're replicating it in communism. Okay, fine. That's what made him famous. But he looked at the English-speaking world, which as a Frenchman he doesn't like. And French people don't like the English-speaking world very much. He said, they're way too individualistic, they're not communal-minded at all. As it happens, he's right. The English-speaking people are among the most individualistic in their family life of anyone in the world. We pick our own spouses. We do not have extended family networks that we rely on. We don't expect our cousins and uncles to look out for us. A lot of people don't hardly know who they are. Very unlike, even places as close to Britain and the USA as Italy and France and places like that, and let alone the Middle East and the Far East and places like that. And unlike many places, you can expect no particular inheritance. Parents completely control what they have, and they can decide to give it to their children or not. The children are on their own in a way that most people find unfathomable in the English-speaking world. And then you come to the United States, where we're settling a frontier.
Unless you're like a scion of a Chicago Democrat family, then you're given a public office.
Well, right, sure. Which is which actually goes against the grain, and which we find objectionable and complain about and call corruption and nepotism, because they're bad things that we don't like.
Not so much that we don't elect those people, but we still ostensibly don't like it.
One of these days, perhaps we'll even see a ray of sunlight here in Chicago, but we may be the last place it happens. But your point is right. So this type of family life that existed in the English-speaking world is different from other places. And if everyone's so individualistic and atomized, they all form their own little mom, dad, and kids household, how do they get anything done? Well, the second genius was the one you pointed out, was this ability to form voluntary associations, networks of voluntary association, high levels of interpersonal trust. That's the distinguishing factor of the United States in our history, throughout our history. And again, we can say, well, the family's falling apart and it's not like it used to be. Even if that's true, by comparison with the rest of the world, we're a lot more like we've always been, and actually like the other English-speaking countries, than we are like anybody else.
Yeah, but what are the trend lines? So illegitimacy rate, 40% in the white community, 70%, 75% in the black community, somewhere in between in the Latino community. How does that work in terms of preserving the unique character of the American family that you talk about in the context of transitioning ultimately? Because what happens when you have the breakdown of the nuclear family? The state intercedes to be mom and or dad. Right.
That's what was the Obama cartoon with the young woman all by herself with no husband? What's her name? Julia. Life of Julia. Right. Yeah, that's the dream. Right.
And by the way, Julia. Right. Julia. Does that name ring a bell? 1984.
Well, 1984. Right. Sure. Exactly. Yeah. Winston Smith's girlfriend. Okay. Compared to the rest of the world, we're still much more of individualistic than we were. As far as family breakdown, there's some sense that the trends are going back the other way. Well, Charles Murray talks about this. Well-off people in American life stay married and look out, take care of their kids, and almost Victorian levels of control of their lives. You know, the helicopter parent, they got to get good grades. We see...
But they don't preach what they practice.
But they don't preach what they practice, because they don't have any cultural confidence, because they don't believe in what they're doing. They want to say one thing that's PC, and then they want to actually go home and do what they do, which actually works.
It's the left. They practice capitalism but espouse socialism.
Right. And so, how long that type of inconsistency is going to last, I don't know. Another thing is people say, well, gee, if it's bad at time T and it's bad at time T2, that's worse, then it'll keep getting worse. Social trends don't tend to be straight lines. Generations go up and down. People react against their parents and grandparents. And the idea that we will have a more civic, more orderly, even religious generation coming ahead of us is certainly possible. There's a Strauss and Howe wrote a book called Generations. It's kind of schematic, but I think the basic idea that these patterns aren't necessarily one direction that they can't change. Victorian England, the generations before them were very loose. You had high levels of illegitimacy. The streets weren't safe. And you had John Wesley and the Methodists, and people started going to church again, and they started getting serious, and they said, I don't want to live in a country like my parents and grandparents gave us. And they cleaned it up. It was a lot better 50 years later. Is that possible in America? Something like it's possible.
Well, it's possible, but again, our America 2.0, before the transition to your, utopia of sorts.
Won't be utopia.
Improvement.
It'll just be
Improvement.
different and
I
hopefully
understand.
better.
You don't believe in imitating the eschaton. I understand. But are we in 2.0, to continue on the kind of French versus English binary construct, are we neo-Jacobins at present?
We're not the French. In France, they have a really strong desire for egalitarianism. Everything has to be equal.
Yes, but they also now, because of the redefinition of institutions that provide the bedrock of Western civilization, like marriage, speaking of the family. Now in France, it's not mom and dad, it's parent one and parent two.
Right.
And so, again, the government interceding, the great fallacy of those that support marriage redefinition is the idea, get government out of the business. Well, what you've done is you've ensconced government more deeply into the business because you need government to intercede, to intervene, to redefine the institution.
Sure.
And so you have governments, parent one and parent two. You have government between parents and children, so children no longer have a natural right to their mom and dad. So with government in that role of blocking children from the natural right to mom and dad, how do you see this playing out in a way that could transition to that elusive America 3.0?
Yeah, the whole current trend we're seeing in this direction, we have 1 or 2% of the population who are gay, just driving a lot of the agenda is sort of odd. I don't know how long it's going to last. We have religious
Committed minority.
Well, yeah, sure. Committed minorities can move the earth if they do.
That's how history has changed, good or bad.
Well, right. The American Revolution, 30% of the people supported the revolutionary cause, and 10% of that were the activists. That's 3% of the population.
Right.
Okay, if we get 3% of the population to push for what we want, we'll move the earth too, okay? I'm not going to tell you I'm happy with these recent developments. I don't know how it's all going to play out. It does seem to me that if you went back 100 years and you looked at the Illinois Marriage and Dissolution of Marriage Act, which I believe has not changed that much, it's almost all about divorce. Because you don't really have to talk about marriage that much because everyone knew what it meant.
Yeah.
100 years ago, everyone was a Protestant. And if you read the Catholic Code of Canon Law definition of marriage, most of the Protestants in America would have accepted that too. It's a permanent, indissoluble union between a man and a woman oriented toward having children. Right? 100 years ago, everyone would have said, yeah, and what's the question? But 50 years ago, we had no-fault divorce come in. That affected the 98% of the people who aren't gay, okay, in a way that was very destructive toward marriage. Now, are we going to see the government definition of marriage get changed back to something we'd prefer to see? I kind of doubt it. What I'd like to see is these religious communities that believe something else just detach themselves from that. You want to have government marriage? Have it. And we're going to define it as we do within our own religious community. We're going to live like that. And just as we have laboratories of democracy, we're going to have communities of moral identity. And if those communities thrive and have lots of kids and are successful, they're going to win out by demographic attrition.
Well, you and your lovely bride have 5 children. You're going to have to continue to be fruitful and multiply, I think, to strike the balance.
Well, trying to get them to think like me is the hard part.
Well, that's for sure.
Transmitting ideas is a lot harder than transmitting your biological entity.
So, as a practicing Catholic, what is your perspective on the importance of faith for this transition that you're optimistic will occur?
This is a very interesting question. It's one we don't touch on in the book, but it merits a book of its own, and it's one of the many projects I'd love to undertake if money should fall from the sky so that they don't have to practice law to make a living. And that's not going to happen.
No,
but I may find a way to carve out the time to write the book. None of this will happen unless people have, I've used the phrase cultural confidence, unless they believe in themselves. Robert Lucas, a Nobel Prize winning economist at the University of Chicago, said, and he was just talking about economic growth and economic development when countries transition from an undeveloped state to a modernizing. He said, people have to have a vision, parents have to have a vision of possible futures for their children that are different from what they've always known. People have to believe that a better future is possible. Now, that doesn't mean that you'd pie in the sky. You have to say, here's a map to get there, okay? This is possible. What faith is going to motivate that is patriotism, things like this, things you can teach in school. Religious faith that you have some commitment to the future would be nice if there were more of that. I will tell you, as a Catholic, certainly we live in 50 years of post-conciliar, post-Vatican II Catholicism in the United States. It has not been a very strong type of thing. Now, perversely, one of the things that makes me sort of hopeful is this. Periods of economic and political turmoil and transition put people in situations where their expectations and what they thought was always stable and always going to be there is disrupted. And they need to look deeper for some source of strength. I would not be surprised to see some fairly significant religious revivals in this country. No doubt some of them taking very exotic forms that we'll all find very surprising, because the creative power of the American people in every area is never to be underestimated.
Is this going to be what Pope Benedict referred to, where the church is going to get smaller? Mm-hmm. And kind of rediscover its identity,
maybe,
and then grow back again. I mean, and that's just the Catholic Church. I'm not limiting it. It's an ecumenical statement, but I'm just using the Catholic Church as an example.
Benedict had a kind of idea that, well, the secularizing trends are going to continue, but we'll be this creative remnant. But John Paul said, there's a springtime of the faith coming, and I can already feel the first breezes of this springtime, to which I say, I sure wish I did. Right?
Yeah.
But he did. And we see it's amazing. This is entrepreneurship in business. There's entrepreneurship in religion as well, right? I mean, the Pentecostal movement started in a storefront church in California in 1910. Now there's hundreds of millions of people are Pentecostals. Okay? So the idea that, in the United States, we saw the Irish, they were really like refugees in New York before the American Civil War. They hadn't really been to church. They were poor. The streets were dangerous. And you had John Hughes, Archbishop of New York. He transformed the place. He got these kids into school. He got all these nuns coming over who were fleeing from Europe to be the school teachers. He got people to take the pledge to not drink. And in 2 generations, people that were considered the just trash of society, their children and grandchildren were police officers, firefighters, and school teachers, and were solid citizens.
And then another John Hughes came along and did Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
There you go.
And so that was an important cultural touchstone.
Hopefully that's hopefully, yes. I don't know where to put that on the curve, Right. There's a curveball, but yeah.
So let me ask you another question, though, maybe coming from an unsuspecting place, an unusual place. Do we see some of the optimism about what this can be, what a free society can be, in the Muslim world? Now, the Arab Spring didn't turn out to be such a spring in North Africa and the Middle East, but what was the spark for the Arab Spring? It was a vendor in Tunisia named Mohammed Bouazizi, who tragically lit himself on fire in front of the Capitol building in Tunis because the government wouldn't allow him, essentially, to make a living. And that sparked outrage even in kind of, not Tunisia, but just generally speaking in the Muslim world, where you've got theocratic republics and repressive regimes.
Right.
That sparked this outcry among some segment of the 1.5 billion Muslims the world over. Right. Is that potentially an unlikely source for the very thing that we're hoping will occur in the West?
Well, as to the Muslim world and what's going to happen there,
because you can't ignore 1.5 billion people.
No, I don't want to ignore anybody. The kind of orthodox Emmanuel Toddian view is this. Very, very briefly, when a community when a community modernizes, you need literacy first. Men get literate, then women get literate. It takes a generation. Women are literate, birth rates fall. They figured out how to control their fertility. And then you generally have a religious backlash, conservative religious backlash for a while, because people feel like the world's being changed under their feet. And then they kind of stabilize in a modern setting. The Muslim world is kind of in the religious backlash phase right now. It's really collapsing fertility rates in the Muslim world. In Iran, it's like one child per couple. It's like Japan. Okay, so that world,
Mark Stein famously said they should have invented the walker instead of the Walkman because their demographics are trending towards oblivion.
Japan too, right? Exactly. So what exactly is going to happen in the Muslim world? I don't think we can't predict a straight line. You can't say, well, we have horrible terrorism and crazy movements there now, so in 50 years it'll be the same, or 100 years it'll be the same. I tend to think this is a stage that hopefully we'll get through. We have to try to not get too damaged by it. So I don't know how much is going to emerge from there. They're sorting out their own their own messes. But the point about Mohammed Bouazizi and this one little episode that sparked this huge uproar is helpful to think about. Because what happens is things look very stable until some spark sets something off and big changes happen, right? Lenin said, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. But things were found, and Montesquieu said, if an empire falls in a single battle, it was ready to fall in a single battle. If the American public sector falls apart in a matter of months and years in ways we don't expect, it's because it's been weakened structurally for a long time. We want to be pushing proposals that are going to help us get through these transitions with good policy proposals and ideas that are going to be helpful so that people have somewhere to turn to when things are going to hell. Milton Friedman said, you promote good policies and good ideas even when people don't want to hear it.
Right.
Because you know you're right, and you know what they're doing won't work, and a lot of them know it won't, but they just benefit from it being like this.
I mean, Milton Friedman proposed school choice in 1950.
And,
right?
and Milton Friedman it may be 2050 before we get it. Hopefully it'll be quite a bit sooner than that. But the point being that he said, but when there's no one left, they'll turn to you. So you have to be there so they can turn to you. You can't say, I give up, I'm going to go sit in my house, watch the game and pretend none of this, give up.
So maybe the intersection of cynicism, which you suggest conservatives and libertarians are kind of want to adopt, and the optimism that you project in your book, America 3.0, is Whittaker Chambers, Witness, which is, as you, I mean, I know you know, but one of the most important books of the 20th century, where he was a Soviet spy who essentially came over to America. He was an atheist. He converted to Catholicism, and
he became a Quaker.
He converted to Christianity. Excuse me.
Yeah.
Right, became a Quaker, and essentially believed that America was on the wrong side of history in the Cold War, but his position was, and he lived kind of a miserable life, even though he was a brilliant writer. I wish he would have lived longer to write more. But his essential position was put in the fight even if you think you're going to lose.
Right.
And is that maybe an admonition for the modern conservatarian?
Well, look, the liberals, progressives, whatever they call themselves this week, have a vision of the future which is crazy and won't work, but they're motivated by a vision of the future. And if you ask a conservative, assume everything goes our way. We elect great people, we change the laws, we change the rules, technology goes our way. What does the world look like in 20 years when your kids are grown-ups and your grandchildren are playing on the lawn and everything's gone right? What's it look like? What are we working toward? None of them have an answer.
Well, and go ahead.
Good. So you got to have a vision to motivate you. Now, we have not the last word, the first word. We need to be having a conversation of where do we want America to be going, and present an alternative. Because if it's just Obama's no good, he's wrecked the country and we're doomed, that's not going to motivate anybody.
No, of course. You can't just curse the darkness. But to end where we began, what does America 3.0 look like? I mean, you talked about technology at the outset. Is 3D printing and driverless cars, is that going to save us from ourselves?
No, look, it isn't that any one technology is going to be some kind of panacea. The idea is that various of these things are moving in the general direction of liberating us from these kind of hierarchical structures. If 10,000 guys have to show up at the factory gate or the steel mill in 1935, it's easy to organize that on a top-down basis. If every manufacturing is distributed literally into every household because we have 3D printing, you no longer need that. You can have family-scale businesses that are very productive. You can co-locate living at home and working again, like we had back when you had family farms and all the benefits of that instead of having 2 hours a day of commuting. What benefits will that bring to family life in America, right? We see a lot of these things as incremental steps toward a future that we prefer to live in than a lot of what we're living under now. But you never want to say, well, this is this one thing that's going to make everything better. It's never like that.
He is Mike Lotus. The book, America 3.0, get it, read it, live it. Mike Lotus, thank you for joining us on Against the Current.
Thank you, Dan.